For 15 years, fans have sworn Walter White and Dexter Morgan sit at the same table. Two flawless anti-heroes from television's greatest era, both untouchable. But run them side by side, and that story falls apart fast. One was built to last 5 seasons, the other wasn't. Which one was actually written better is the question this comes down to. Section 1. 2 bald men and one simple question. Somewhere in the long conversation that fans have been having about Breaking Bad for more than 15 years now, a strange little argument keeps surfacing. It never fully goes away. It flares up in comment sections, in late-night discussions, in the quiet moment after someone finishes rewatching the show for the 3rd or 4th time. The argument is not about whether Walter White is a great character, because everyone already agrees that he is. It is not about whether the show is one of the finest dramas ever made, because that question was settled long ago. The argument is smaller than that, and somehow more interesting. It asks which of the 2 great criminal minds at the heart of the series was actually the smarter man. Was it Walter White, the chemistry teacher who became a monster? Or was it the soft-spoken owner of a fried chicken restaurant who almost never raised his voice and almost never made a mistake? On the surface, it looks like an easy question with an obvious answer. Walter White wins in the end. He is the one still breathing when the other man is dead. He is the one who engineered the death of his rival, who walked away from that particular battle victorious, who went on to build an empire even larger than the one he tore down. If the whole thing were simply a contest, a fight to see who could kill whom, then the scoreboard would seem to close the discussion before it even began. The teacher beat the businessman, case closed. And yet the argument refuses to die, because the people who keep raising it sense something that the scoreboard does not capture. They sense that winning a single confrontation and being the smarter person are not the same thing at all, and that the man who lost that confrontation may have been, in almost every way that matters, the more intelligent of the 2. To even begin to weigh this fairly, it helps to slow down and look at the 2 men not as a hero and a villain, not even as a protagonist and an antagonist, but as 2 solutions to the same problem. Both of them were trying to do the same thing. Both of them were trying to build and run a large, secret, illegal business without getting caught, without getting killed, and without losing the ordinary life they wanted to protect. That is the puzzle each of them faced. The show gives us the rare gift of watching 2 very different kinds of mind attack the exact same puzzle, in the same city, in the same trade, at roughly the same time. That is what makes the comparison so rich. It is a controlled experiment in intelligence, run inside a television drama, and the 2 subjects could hardly be more different in how they went about it. Walter White is the one the audience knows from the inside. The series spends 5 seasons living behind his eyes, following his thoughts, watching him solve one impossible problem after another, with nothing but his knowledge of chemistry and his ability to think 3 steps ahead when his back is against the wall. He is, without question, a genius in the narrow sense of raw mental horsepower. He can look at a locked room and find a way out of it. He can look at a poison and figure out how to use it. He can look at a rival and, given enough time and desperation, invent a plan that no one else in the story could have dreamed up. When people say Walter White is the smartest character on the show, they are usually pointing at this, at his flexibility, his speed, his ability to improvise brilliance in the middle of a crisis. And they are not wrong about any of it. The other man is harder to know, and that difficulty is the first clue to who he really is. His name, or at least the name he goes by, is Gustavo Fring. Most of Albuquerque knows him as the polite, tidy, endlessly reasonable owner of a popular chain of fried chicken restaurants called Los Pollos Hermanos. He wears glasses and pressed yellow shirts. He clears tables himself and asks customers how their meal was. He gives money to local charities and, in a detail so bold it almost seems like a joke, he donates generously to the local office of the Drug Enforcement Administration, the very agency whose entire job is to catch men exactly like him. He befriends the agents. He shakes their hands. He hides, as he himself once puts it, in plain sight. And underneath that spotless surface, he runs the largest and most successful drug distribution operation the region has ever seen, moving product through refrigerated trucks and legitimate businesses, laundering the money through a chain of restaurants, all without a single fingerprint of suspicion landing on him for the better part of 20 years. 20 years. That number deserves to sit in the air for a moment, because it is the heart of everything this comparison turns on. Walter White ran his operation for roughly 2 years before it consumed him and everyone around him. Gustavo Fring ran his for 2 decades, quietly, invisibly, without the law ever laying a hand on him, until the very end. The teacher burned bright and fast, and destroyed everything he touched, including himself, in the span of a single terminal illness. The businessman burned slow and cold and steady, for a period of time longer than most legitimate companies survive. If the puzzle both men were trying to solve was how to run a secret empire without being caught, then one of them solved it for 2 years, and one of them solved it for 20. And only one of those is close to what success would actually look like. But raw longevity is not the whole of intelligence either, and the argument would be a shallow one if it stopped there. What makes the comparison genuinely fascinating is that the 2 men were not simply good and bad at the same skill. They were good and bad at entirely different things. Walter White possessed a kind of intelligence that Gus Fring almost never displayed, the quick, inventive, problem-solving genius that could turn a chemistry set into a weapon and a hopeless situation into an escape. And Gus Fring possessed a kind of intelligence that Walter White almost never displayed, the patient, disciplined, emotionally controlled wisdom that could wait for years, could resist every temptation to boast or to lash out, could keep a secret buried so deep that even the people closest to him never guessed it was there. The teacher was smarter in the moment. The businessman was smarter over time. And the whole question of who was the smarter man comes down to which of those 2 things you believe matters more. There is a reason the writers built the show this way, and it was not an accident. When Gus Fring was created, he was designed from the ground up to be the opposite of everything the audience had seen in the criminal world up to that point. The drug dealers Walt had tangled with before Gus were loud, violent, unpredictable men, driven by appetite and rage, the kind of criminals who screamed and threatened and killed on impulse. Gus was written to be the exact reverse of all of that. Where those men were chaotic, he was orderly. Where they were hot, he was cold. Where they craved attention, he craved invisibility. The writers wanted a villain who was not a screaming lunatic, but a buttoned-down, soft-spoken, cold-blooded businessman. Someone whose menace came not from how much noise he made, but from how little. And in doing that, they created something more than just a new obstacle for Walt to overcome. They created a mirror. They created the version of a criminal mastermind that Walt imagined himself to be, and set it right next to the reality of what Walt actually was, so the audience could see the gap between the 2. That gap is the real subject of this whole discussion. Walter White wanted to be the man in control. He wanted to be the calm, respected, untouchable figure who ran an empire from the shadows and answered to no one. That was the fantasy that drove him, the dream of finally mattering, of finally being someone. And standing right there in the same story was a man who had actually achieved that fantasy, who had built and held exactly the kind of power Walt longed for, and who had done it not through flashy brilliance, but through relentless discipline and patience and self-control. Gus Fring was, in a sense, Walt's future, if Walt had ever managed to master himself. And the tragedy, or the lesson, buried in the comparison, is that Walt never could. He had the intelligence to build the empire. He never had the discipline to keep it, or to keep himself from destroying it. None of this is to take anything away from what Walter White accomplished, and it would be dishonest to pretend that Gus was simply the better man in every respect. Walt did beat him. That fact cannot be waved away, and it cannot be explained purely as luck, though luck played its part. Walt found a way to kill a man that no one else in the story could touch, and he found it by using his mind in a way that was genuinely, frighteningly clever. Any honest look at this question has to reckon with that victory and take it seriously. Because a comparison that simply crowns Gus and ignores the fact that he ended up dead on the floor of a nursing home is not a comparison worth making. The interesting version of this argument is the one that holds both truths at the same time. Gus was, in most ways, the smarter operator, and Walt still won. Understanding how both of those things can be true is the entire journey this video is going to take. So the plan from here is straightforward. We are going to take the two men apart, piece by piece, and lay their minds side by side. We are going to look at how each of them was built, at the blueprints the writers drew before either character said a word, because the difference between them was baked in from the very beginning. We are going to look at the masks they wore, at the way each man presented himself to the world, and at what those masks revealed about what each of them actually wanted underneath. We are going to look at patience, at the almost superhuman ability of one man to wait 20 years for a single act of revenge, and at the way the other man could barely wait 20 minutes before doing something rash. We are going to look at emotional control, at the moments when each man was pushed to his absolute limit, and at how differently they responded when the pressure came. And we are going to look at the blind spots, the fatal weaknesses that each of these brilliant minds carried without ever quite seeing. Because in the end, both of them were undone, not by a lack of intelligence, but by something intelligence alone could not fix. Along the way, it is worth keeping one thing in mind, because it will sharpen everything that follows. The question is not who was more of a genius in the classroom sense. On pure intellect, on the ability to solve a hard problem quickly, a strong case can be made that Walt actually stood above Gus. His thinking was faster and more flexible. He could improvise in ways that Gus, for all his planning, rarely needed to. If the two of them sat down to a test of pure cleverness, Walt might well have come out ahead. But intelligence in the real world, and especially in the deadly world these two men lived in, is about far more than cleverness. It is about knowing yourself. It is about controlling yourself. It is about resisting the pull of your own ego long enough to make the choice that keeps you alive, instead of the choice that makes you feel powerful. And on that measure, the measure that actually decided whether a man lived or died in this story, Gus Fring operated on a level Walter White never reached. That is the case this video is going to build. Not that Walt was stupid, because he was anything but. Not that Gus was flawless, because his flaws were what killed him. But that of the two men, one understood the game they were both playing far more deeply than the other, played it with a discipline the other could never match, and survived at it for 10 times as long. The teacher had the more dazzling mind, the businessman had the wiser one, and in a world where a single moment of pride could get a man killed, wisdom was worth far more than dazzle. The rest of this journey is about proving exactly that, one careful layer at a time, starting with the moment each of these men first stepped into the story, and the very different ways they were designed to think. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The two men now stand side by side, framed by the real question, not who won a single fight, but who truly understood the game. Next come the blueprints the writers drew before either man spoke a word. What lies there is a difference so deep it decided everything that followed. Section 2. Chaos and Control. The Two Blueprints. Long before an actor ever steps in front of a camera, a character exists only on paper, as a set of decisions made in a quiet room by the people writing the show. Those early decisions are invisible to almost everyone who later watches the finished story. Viewers see the performance, the face, the voice, the way a man moves through a scene, and they rarely stop to think that all of it began as a choice on a page. Yet those first choices shape everything. They decide what a character can and cannot do, how he will think, how he will react when the pressure comes. And in the case of these two men, the choices made at the very beginning point in almost exactly opposite directions. Understanding where each of them started is the key to understanding why one of them could wait 20 years and the other could barely wait an afternoon. Walter White was built to change. That was the whole idea behind him, stated plainly by the man who created the show. The pitch, famously, was to take a mild and harmless figure, a gentle schoolteacher, and turn him over the length of a series into something hard and ruthless and frightening. The character was designed as a journey from one kind of man into another. A slow transformation from a person who could barely bring himself to hurt anyone into a person who would poison a child to get what he wanted. That design has enormous consequences for how Walt thinks and behaves, because a man built to transform is, by definition, a man in motion. He is never settled, he is always becoming something, and a mind that is always becoming something is a mind that is, in a sense, unstable, always reaching, always testing how far it can go, always a little ahead of or behind the person it used to be. Gustavo Fring was built to be exactly the opposite. He was created to be a fixed point, a man of total control, someone who had already become whatever he was going to become long before the audience ever met him. When the writers needed a new antagonist, they were not looking for someone who would grow and change across the seasons. They were looking for a stable, permanent threat. A man who was the same in his last scene as in his first, whose power came precisely from the fact that nothing seemed to move him. Where Walt was designed as a journey, Gus was designed as a wall. And a wall does not need to improvise. A wall does not lash out. A wall simply holds its shape, year after year, while everything crashes against it and fails to break it. That single difference in design, motion versus stillness, is the root of nearly everything that separates the two men. The reason Gus was created at all makes the contrast even sharper. He came into being as a replacement. The show had a violent, chaotic drug dealer in its early stretch, a screaming, unstable, drug-using lunatic of a man, the kind of criminal who was terrifying precisely because he was unpredictable and could explode into violence at any second. When the actor playing that character became unavailable, the writers had to invent someone new to fill the gap in the story. And here is where the genius of the decision shows itself. They did not simply write another chaotic dealer. They wrote the total opposite. They took everything that the earlier character was: loud, hot-tempered, impulsive, addicted, out of control. And they built a new man who was quiet, cold, patient, sober, and in complete command of himself at all times. Gus was designed, from his very first moment, as the answer to chaos. He was order made flesh. He was what a criminal looked like when he had mastered every impulse that got other criminals killed. That design purpose, to be the opposite of chaos, is worth holding on to, because it explains the strange power Gus has in every scene he appears in. The other criminals in Walt's world announce their danger. They shout, they threaten, they wave guns, they make it obvious that they are men to be feared. Gus does the reverse. He hides his danger completely beneath the surface. so calm and so pleasant that it takes the audience, and the characters, a long time to understand what he really is. When he first appears, he is simply a helpful restaurant owner, so unremarkable that Walt looks right past him, unable to believe that this tidy, polite man could be the powerful figure he was sent to meet. That is the design working exactly as intended. A man built for control does not need to look dangerous. His control is the danger. The stillness itself is the threat, because a person who never loses himself, never reacts, never shows his hand, is a person you can never predict and never get ahead of. Now place the two blueprints next to each other and think about what each one produces in the way of a thinking mind. Walt, built to change, is built to be driven. Something inside him is always pushing, always dissatisfied, always reaching for more, because a character whose entire arc is transformation cannot ever be allowed to rest. The engine of his story is desire. The desire to become bigger, more powerful, more respected, more feared. And desire, however brilliant the mind carrying it, is a restless and dangerous thing. It makes a person want, and wanting, badly enough, clouds judgment. It pushes a man toward the choice that feeds the hunger, rather than the choice that keeps him safe. Walt's intelligence was real, but it was always harnessed to a hunger that never quieted, and a hungry mind, no matter how sharp, will sooner or later make a hungry decision. Gus, built for control, was built around the absence of that hunger, or rather, around the total mastery of it. Whatever he wanted, and he wanted things very badly, as we will see, he had trained himself never to let the wanting show, and never to let it drive him into a mistake. His entire way of operating was based on the principle that the goal mattered more than the feeling, that a plan carried out slowly and safely was worth infinitely more than a satisfaction grabbed quickly and recklessly. Where Walt's mind was a hungry engine, Gus's mind was a locked vault. He could hold a desire inside himself for years without acting on it, waiting for the single moment when acting would carry no risk. That is not a different level of raw intelligence. It is a different kind of intelligence entirely, the intelligence of self-mastery, and it is the kind Walt almost completely lacked. The show demonstrates the difference in how each man does business, right from their earliest scenes together. When Gus first considers working with Walt, he does not leap at the opportunity, even though Walt's product is the finest he has ever encountered. He investigates, he watches, he takes his time. He looks into everyone he does business with, as he says himself, and he holds back until he is as certain as he can be that the partnership is safe. He even tests Walt in small ways, observing how he handles himself, noting the warning signs. When Walt brings his partner Jesse to a meeting, and the young man is visibly under the influence, Gus quietly registers it as a mark against them both. Because to Gus, a partner who cannot control himself is a liability that could bring the whole operation down. He never makes the same mistake twice, and he expects the same of anyone he works with. That is the mind of a man who thinks in terms of years, who weighs every decision against the survival of the whole enterprise, who would rather walk away from a good thing than risk everything on a bad partner. Walt, by contrast, is forever making the fast decision, the bold decision, the decision that solves the problem right in front of him without regard for the mess it will create down the line. This is where his quick, flexible, improvising genius actually works against him. Because he can always think his way out of an immediate crisis, he keeps walking into crises he did not need to create. He trusts his own cleverness so completely that he takes risks a more cautious man would never take, confident that if things go wrong, he can invent a solution on the spot, and often he can. But every one of those improvised escapes leaves a loose thread, a body, a witness, a lie that will have to be maintained, and over time, the loose threads multiply until they become a noose. Gus's slowness was not a weakness. It was the discipline of a man who understood that the most dangerous thing in his line of work was not a hard problem, but an unnecessary one, and who arranged his entire life to avoid creating problems he did not have to face. There is a deeper point hidden in these two blueprints, and it is worth drawing out clearly, because it goes to the very center of the question this video is asking. Walt's design, the design of transformation, meant that he was defined by his drive, and his drive was rooted in a wound, in years of feeling overlooked and unappreciated, in a bitterness about a life he felt had cheated him. Everything he built was an attempt to heal that wound, to prove something, to finally be seen. That means his empire was never really about the business at all. It was about him, about his ego, about his need to matter. And a business run to feed a man's ego is a business that will eventually be sacrificed to that ego. Because when the moment comes to choose between the safe path and the path that makes him feel powerful, a man like that will choose the feeling nearly every time. Gus's design, the design of control, meant that whatever wound he carried, and he carried a terrible one, he had subordinated it completely to the plan. His empire was not primarily about making him feel like a big man. It was a machine, built to accomplish specific goals, protected at every turn, and never once risked for the sake of a moment's pride. When you watch Gus operate, you almost never catch him doing something simply because it feels good. Every move serves the larger design. Even the moments that look like indulgence, and there is one very important exception we will come to much later, are rare enough to stand out, precisely because they are so unlike him. For the overwhelming majority of his time on screen, Gus is a man who has placed the mission above the self, which is the single hardest thing for any ambitious person to do, and the thing Walt could never manage for more than a scene or two at a stretch. It would be easy to hear all of this and conclude that Gus was simply a cold machine, while Walt was a warm human being, and that the coldness was what made Gus effective. But that is not quite right, and getting it right matters. Gus was not without feeling. Underneath his control was a reservoir of emotion, so deep and so powerful that it drove his entire life, as we will discover. The difference was not that Gus felt nothing, and Walt felt everything. The difference was that Gus had learned to lock his feelings away and let his mind govern his actions, while Walt let his feelings, especially his pride and his resentment, sit in the driver's seat, while his brilliant mind worked frantically to justify wherever those feelings took him. Both men were intelligent. Both men were emotional. Only one of them had arranged those two forces in the right order, with the mind in command and the emotions in service, rather than the other way around. That ordering, decided at the level of the blueprint before either character drew a breath, is the foundation of everything else this video will examine. The man built to change was built to be driven by hunger, and a driven man takes risks. The man built for control was built to be governed by discipline, and a disciplined man survives. When the two of them finally collided, it was, at the deepest level, a collision between these two blueprints, between motion and stillness, between hunger and mastery, between a genius who could not control himself and an operator who had made control his entire art. Which blueprint produced the smarter man is a question we are only beginning to answer. But already the shape of the answer is coming into view, and it points toward the quiet man in the pressed yellow shirt, standing perfectly still while the world rushes past him, waiting. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Two opposite designs emerge from the blueprints. One man built to change and driven by hunger, the other built for control and governed by discipline. Next come the masks these two men wore before the world, and what each disguise quietly revealed about the hunger or the control hiding underneath. Section 3. The masks they wore. Every criminal who wants to stay free has to wear some kind of mask. The mask is the ordinary face a person shows to the world, the disguise that lets them walk through daylight while their real work happens in the dark. A man cannot run a secret empire while looking like a man who runs a secret empire. He has to look like something else, something harmless, something the world will glance at and forget. So both of the men at the center of this story built themselves a public face, a version of themselves that neighbors and co-workers and even family could see without ever suspecting what lay underneath. But the masks they chose and the way they wore them could not have been more different. And in that difference lies one of the clearest signs of who understood the game more deeply. Because a man's disguise always says something about what he is really trying to hide and what he is really trying to get. Consider first the mask Gus Fring wore, because it is one of the great disguises in all of television. To the city around him, Gus was the owner of a beloved chain of fried chicken restaurants. Not a shadowy figure, not a recluse, not a man who kept to the edges of respectable life, but a warm and visible pillar of the community. He ran his restaurants personally, walking the floor, wiping down tables, greeting customers, asking how their food was, projecting the image of a modest, hard-working small businessman who had built something good through honest effort. He gave to local charities. He served on a hospital board. And in the boldest stroke of all, he cultivated a close relationship with the local office of the Drug Enforcement Administration, the very agency dedicated to hunting men like him, making large donations to their events, and befriending the agents personally, right down to the man in charge. He drove not a luxury car, but a modest, aging Volvo, the vehicle of a man with nothing to prove and nothing to flaunt. Every detail of the disguise pointed the same direction, away from suspicion, toward the image of an ordinary, decent, forgettable citizen. The genius of this mask is not just that it was convincing, it is that it was aimed in exactly the right direction. Gus understood that the greatest danger to a criminal is attention, and so he built a public life designed to deflect attention completely. By becoming a friend of the DEA, he did not merely hide from them, he turned the hunters into his allies, made them think of him as one of the good ones, someone on their side, so that when suspicion eventually did fall on him, the very people investigating could not bring themselves to believe it. When one sharp agent finally began to suspect that the chicken man might be the kingpin, he was practically laughed out of the room, because everyone who knew Gus knew him as a supporter of law enforcement, a man who gave money to fight the drug trade. The mask did not just conceal Gus. It actively protected him, building a wall of goodwill and reputation that his enemies would have to break through before they could even begin to see the truth. That is not a disguise thrown together out of fear. That is a disguise engineered, over decades, by a mind that thought about survival at the deepest possible level. There is something even more telling in the details of how Gus wore the mask. He almost never broke character. When he first meets Walt, he stays fully in his role as the polite restaurant owner, and only steps out of it when there is a genuine reason to, and even then, only for the shortest possible time, before slipping back behind the pleasant, forgettable surface. His control over the disguise was total. He could stand in a room with the men hunting him, comfort the family of an agent he had every reason to want dead, and never let a single crack show. He hid, in his own words, in plain sight, and the phrase is worth dwelling on because it captures the whole philosophy. He did not run from the light. He walked directly into it, so completely disguised as something harmless that the light itself became his best protection. The busier and more public and more respectable his ordinary life looked, the safer his secret one became. Now turn to the mask Walter White wore, and the contrast is immediate and revealing. Walt's disguise was, on the surface, similar. To the outside world, he was a mild high school chemistry teacher, a family man, a person so unremarkable that no one would ever imagine him at the center of a drug empire. In the beginning, this worked in his favor for the same reason Gus's mask worked, because no one suspects the harmless. But here is the crucial difference. Gus was content to be the mask. He wanted, more than anything, to remain the forgettable chicken man, because being forgettable kept him alive. Walt could not bear it. The whole engine of Walt's story was his hatred of being overlooked, his burning need to be recognized as the powerful and brilliant man he believed himself to be. And a man who craves recognition cannot truly wear a mask, because the entire point of a mask is to make you invisible, and invisibility was the one thing Walt could not stand. This is where the two men reveal the opposite hungers driving them. Gus wore his mask to disappear. Walt wore his mask only because he had to, and he chafed against it constantly, forever pushing at its edges, forever letting the real man underneath peek through. He invented an alias, a second name, and a second identity, complete with a hat that he could put on when he wanted to feel powerful. And the very existence of that second self tells you everything. Gus needed only one face, the harmless one, because the harmless face was all he wanted the world to see. Walt needed two, the meek teacher for safety and the feared kingpin for satisfaction, because he could not accept being only the harmless one. He wanted, desperately, for someone to know what he had become. And that want, that need to be seen, is the exact opposite of what a good disguise requires. The show gives this contrast a perfect scene, one where the two philosophies of the mask are laid side by side in a single conversation. Gus, keeping up his image as a friend of law enforcement, arrives at a hospital where an injured agent lies recovering, bringing food for the officers keeping watch, playing the role of the generous community supporter to the hilt. Walt, present for family reasons, watches this performance and confronts Gus quietly, asking whether the appearance is a message aimed at him. And Gus explains, calmly, that he is simply supporting his community, hiding in plain sight, the same way Walt does. The line is a needle, gentle and precise, because it draws the comparison Gus wants Walt to feel. We are the same, the line suggests, both of us hiding behind ordinary lives. But they are not the same at all, and the rest of the story proves it. Gus hides in plain sight and stays hidden. Walt hides in plain sight and cannot help stepping out into the open, again and again, because the whole reason he is doing any of this is so that people will finally look at him. That difference has consequences, and they are deadly. Walt's inability to stay behind the mask is directly responsible for some of the worst damage in the entire series. There is a moment, well into his rise, when he has essentially gotten away with everything. The authorities believe another man was the genius behind the famous blue product. Walt is in the clear, unsuspected, safe. All he has to do is stay quiet, stay the harmless teacher, let the world go on thinking he is nobody. And he cannot do it. His pride will not allow another man to be credited with his work. At a family gathering, hearing that dead chemist praised as a genius, Walt cannot stop himself from insisting that the real mastermind must still be out there, that this other man was merely copying someone far more brilliant. He does this while sitting across from the very agent hunting him, and in doing so, he plants the seed that will eventually lead that agent back to the truth. His ego cannot tolerate being invisible, even when invisibility is the only thing keeping him free. Gus would sooner have died than say such a thing. Walt could not keep it in. This is the heart of the matter when it comes to the masks. A disguise is only as good as a person's willingness to disappear into it, and disappearing was precisely what Walt could not do, and Gus did effortlessly. The reason traces straight back to the blueprints. Walt was built around a hunger for recognition, so wearing a mask was a constant torment to him, a daily denial of the very thing he was chasing. Gus was built around control and around a goal that had nothing to do with being admired, so wearing a mask cost him nothing. He did not need the world to know his greatness. He needed the world to leave him alone so that he could accomplish what he had set out to do. For Gus, the mask was a tool, comfortable and natural. For Walt, the mask was a cage, and he kept rattling the bars. It is worth noticing, too, what each man's public life actually gave him, because even here, Gus operated on a higher level. Walt's mask was purely defensive. The teacher identity protected him, but offered him nothing else. It was a shell to hide inside. Gus's mask was defensive and productive at the same time. The restaurant chain was not just a disguise. It was a real, functioning, profitable business that also served as the machinery for moving product and laundering money, so that the same operation that hid him also enriched him and powered his empire. The trucks that delivered chicken delivered far more than chicken. The legitimate business and the criminal one were woven together so tightly that they could not be pulled apart, which meant the disguise was not a separate thing bolted onto the crime, but the crime's own circulatory system. That is a level of integration Walt never came close to. His fronts were always clumsy afterthoughts, businesses acquired to wash money and constantly threatening to expose him. Gus built his cover and his empire as a single organism, each part protecting and feeding the other. And there is one more layer to Gus's mask, revealed most fully in the story of his earlier years, that shows just how deep his commitment to concealment ran. His entire identity may itself have been a construction. When the authorities and even his own most trusted people tried to look into his past, they found almost nothing. No records, no history, no trace of the man before he arrived in the country. The name he used may not even have been his real one. He had, it seems, erased himself, wiped away whatever he had been before, so completely that no one could reconstruct it. That is the ultimate version of the mask, a man who disguised not just his present, but his entire past, who understood that a person with no history is a person who cannot be traced, cornered, or predicted. Walt, by contrast, left a trail everywhere he went, a trail of bodies and lies and clues, because he was too impatient and too proud to cover his tracks with anything like the same care. Put it all together, and the masks tell a clear story about the two minds behind them. Gus wore a disguise perfectly suited to his goal, because his goal was to survive and to accomplish a hidden purpose, and a perfect disguise serves both. Walt wore a disguise poorly suited to his goal, because his goal, underneath everything, was to be recognized, and no disguise can serve a man who wants to be seen. One man understood that safety lay in disappearing, and made himself disappear. The other man wanted safety and glory at the same time, two things that could not coexist, and in reaching for the glory, he kept sabotaging the safety. The chicken man in the pressed yellow shirt, forgettable and pleasant and utterly hidden, was doing something far harder and far smarter than the teacher, who could not stop reminding the world how brilliant he was. And the mask was only the surface of it. Underneath the disguise lay an even greater difference, in the one quality that more than any other separates a criminal who survives from one who does not: patience. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. One man vanished perfectly into his disguise, while the other could never stop stepping out from behind his. Next comes patience, the almost unimaginable ability of one man to wait 20 years for a single act of revenge, and what that endurance reveals about the mind behind it. Section 4. 20 years of waiting. Of all the qualities that separate one kind of mind from another, patience is among the hardest to fake and the easiest to underestimate. It does not look like intelligence. It does not dazzle. A patient person, watched from the outside, often seems to be doing nothing at all, simply waiting, letting time pass, holding back while others rush ahead. And yet, patience may be the truest measure of a certain kind of intelligence. The kind that understands that the goal matters more than the feeling, that a satisfaction delayed is often a satisfaction secured, and that the person who can wait will almost always outlast the person who cannot. When you place these two men side by side on the question of patience, the gap between them is not a matter of degree. It is a matter of kind. One of them could wait for 2 decades. The other could barely wait for 2 days. And that single difference, more than raw cleverness, more than any specific plan, is what allowed one man to survive for 20 years and doomed the other to burn out in 2. The story of Gus Fring's patience begins with the worst moment of his life, a wound so deep that it shaped everything he became. Long before the events of the show, back in his earlier years, Gus had a partner. The two of them built the first version of the chicken restaurant together, and the partner was a gifted chemist whose talent Gus had recognized and nurtured, even paying for the man's education. There was more between them than business, and the show gradually makes clear that this partner was the person Gus loved most in the world. Together, they tried to break into the drug trade by pitching their product to the leader of a powerful cartel, hoping he would give them the reach they needed. But the pitch went badly. The cartel boss felt insulted, felt that the two men had been operating behind his back, and to punish them, he ordered his enforcer to shoot the partner in the head, right there, at the edge of a pool, forcing Gus to watch. Gus broke down. He wept over the body of the man he loved, and the cartel boss spared his life, telling him that the only reason he was not killed too was because of who he really was, whatever that meant, and leaving him alive to carry the loss. Now consider what a man does with a wound like that. Most people, faced with such a loss and such a humiliation, would react in one of 2 ways. They would either be crushed by it, folding inward, giving up, or they would lash out, driven by rage, striking back as soon as they could, in some furious act of revenge that would almost certainly get them killed. Both reactions are human, and both are what a man like Walter White would very likely have done, because both are driven by feeling rather than by plan. Gus did neither. Gus took that grief and that rage, the most powerful emotions a human being can carry, and he locked them away, and he began to wait, not for a week, not for a year. He waited for roughly 20 years, keeping his hatred perfectly hidden, playing the loyal partner to the very cartel that had murdered the man he loved, building his empire quietly, all the while, biding his time until the moment came when he could take his revenge completely and safely, all at once, with no risk of failure. Think about what that requires. For 2 decades, Gus sat across from the men who had killed his partner and smiled. He did business with them. He took their orders, at least outwardly. He nursed his grudge in total silence, never once letting it show, never once acting on it prematurely, never once allowing the enormous pressure of his grief to force his hand before the time was right. Every day for 20 years he had to master the impulse to strike, to say something, to do something, and every day for 20 years he succeeded in mastering it. That is not coldness. That is the opposite of coldness. It is a volcano of feeling, held under perfect control by a mind so disciplined that it could subordinate even the deepest human agony to the demands of the plan. Whatever else you want to say about Gus Fring, the sheer endurance of that patience places him in a category of self-mastery that almost no one, in fiction or in life, ever reaches. And when the moment finally came, the revenge was as complete and as controlled as the wait had been long. Gus arranged a meeting with the cartel leadership under the guise of finally submitting to them, of coming to terms. He brought a gift, a bottle of rare and expensive liquor, the kind of thing a man offers as a gesture of respect and peace. What no one at that gathering knew was that the liquor was poisoned, and here the discipline of the plan reveals itself in a detail that is almost unbelievable. The cartel boss was suspicious, too cautious to drink first, and insisted that Gus drink before anyone else. Gus had anticipated exactly this. Before the meeting, he had swallowed something to protect himself, and when the boss demanded he drink first, Gus did so without hesitation, calmly downing the poison along with everyone else, betting his own life on his preparation. Then, once the poison was in every glass and every man had drunk, Gus quietly excused himself, went to a bathroom, and forced himself to vomit up as much of the poison as he could, purging his own body, while the men who killed his partner died one by one behind him. Even in that moment of purging, the discipline held. He did not panic, he did not rush. He removed his jacket and folded it carefully, placed a towel beneath his knees, and only then attended to the business of saving his own life, so precise and controlled that even in the act of vomiting poison, he could not bring himself to be sloppy, and the poison nearly killed him anyway. He had absorbed enough that he needed real medical care to survive, that he came genuinely close to death in the service of his revenge. He was willing to risk his own life to make sure the plan worked, but he did everything humanly possible to tilt the odds, and he pulled it off. 20 years of waiting, resolved in a single afternoon, executed so cleanly that the entire leadership of the cartel was wiped out at once, and Gus walked away, weakened but alive, his revenge finally complete. That is what patience looks like when it is married to intelligence. It is not passive. It is the most active thing in the world, a plan carried out over decades, with a single moment of perfect execution at the end. Now set that beside Walter White, and the difference is almost painful. Walt could not wait. Waiting was, in a sense, the thing his entire character was least capable of. His whole reason for entering the drug trade was that he felt time was running out, that his life had passed him by, that he had to act now, immediately, before it was too late. Urgency was built into him from the start. And that urgency, useful as it sometimes was in a crisis, made him constitutionally incapable of the kind of long, patient endurance that defined Gus. When Walt wanted something, he wanted it now. When Walt was insulted, he wanted to answer the insult now. When Walt saw an opportunity or a threat, he acted on it fast, often too fast, unable to sit still and let the situation develop, unable to trust that waiting might serve him better than moving. The show is full of examples, but the pattern is what matters more than any single one. Walt repeatedly created disasters for himself by acting on impulse when patience would have saved him. He killed when he did not need to kill. He confronted when he did not need to confront. He revealed himself when he should have stayed hidden. Perhaps the clearest window into his nature is the way he responded to being underestimated or disrespected. Where Gus could absorb 20 years of the deepest possible disrespect, could smile at the murderers of his beloved, and wait patiently for his moment, Walt could not tolerate even a small slight for more than a scene. When a business owner once insulted his manhood, Walt became fixated on buying that man's very business, out of spite, turning a petty wound into a driving obsession. When his associates blamed the operation's troubles on his pride and his need to be the biggest man in every room, he could not let it go, and eventually, he killed one of them in a burst of wounded rage, an impulsive act he regretted almost the instant it was done, realizing too late that the killing had been completely unnecessary and had gained him nothing. That contrast between a man who waited 20 years and a man who could not wait 20 minutes is the single most revealing measure of who understood the game more deeply. Because in the world these two men lived in, patience was not a nicety, it was survival itself. Every impulsive act left a trail. Every hasty killing created a loose end. Every moment of pride indulged in the heat of anger became a crack in the wall that would eventually let the danger in. Walt's inability to wait meant that he was constantly generating new threats, new risks, new problems that a more patient man would simply have avoided. Gus's ability to wait meant that he almost never created a problem he did not have to, that he let time and circumstance do much of his work for him, that he moved only when moving was safe and stayed still the rest of the time. The patient man makes fewer mistakes, and in a world where a single mistake can be fatal, fewer mistakes is the whole ballgame. There is a deeper psychological truth buried in this contrast, and it is worth naming plainly. Patience of the kind Gus displayed requires a person to place the goal above the self. It requires the ability to endure discomfort, humiliation, grief, and delay, all for the sake of an outcome that lies far in the future, without needing the immediate satisfaction of acting. This is the hardest thing in the world for a proud person to do, because pride demands to be satisfied now, demands to answer every insult, demands to feel powerful in the present moment, rather than trusting that power will come later. Gus had somehow conquered his pride, or at least chained it so completely that it almost never drove his actions. Walt's pride ran his life, and a mind ruled by pride, however brilliant, will always sacrifice the long game for the short one, will always choose the satisfaction it can have today over the victory it might have tomorrow. That is why Walt could outthink Gus in a single moment of crisis, but could never have outlasted him over years, because the game was not really a test of cleverness at all. It was a test of self-control, and self-control was exactly what Walt did not have. It would be a mistake, though, to imagine that Gus's patience made him invulnerable, or that the story ends with patience simply winning. The very same wound that gave Gus his extraordinary patience, the murder of the man he loved, also planted the one seed of feeling that he could never fully master, and that seed would eventually grow into the flaw that killed him. We will come to that. But for now, the point stands, and it stands as clearly as anything in the whole comparison. The ability to wait, to hold a burning purpose inside oneself for 20 years without letting it force a single premature move, is one of the highest forms of intelligence a person operating in a dangerous world can possess. Gus had it to a degree that borders on the superhuman. Walt did not have it at all. And in the difference between a man who waited 2 decades and a man who could not wait 2 days, we find one of the strongest pieces of evidence for who, in the truest sense, was the smarter operator. Patience, in the end, is only one face of a larger quality, the quality of emotional control, of keeping the feelings in service to the mind rather than the other way around. We have seen how Gus controlled the longest and deepest of his emotions across the longest stretch of time. Next, we will see how he controlled his emotions in the shortest and most intense moments, the moments of sudden pressure, of shock, of provocation, when a man's true nature shows itself in an instant. And there, too, in the way each man behaved when the heat came without warning, the gap between them opens wide. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. One man waited 20 years for his revenge, while the other could not wait 20 minutes to answer an insult. Next comes emotional control in the heat of the moment, how each man behaved when the pressure struck without warning. What they did in those instants reveals which mind truly ruled the man. Section 5. Grace under pressure. There is a particular kind of test that only comes without warning. It is not the long test of patience, the slow discipline of waiting for years. It is the sudden one, the moment when everything goes wrong at once. When a plan collapses, or a threat appears, or a shock lands out of nowhere, and a person has only seconds to respond. In that instant, there is no time to think carefully, no time to prepare, no time to hide behind a rehearsed mask. Whatever a person truly is comes out in those seconds, because the pressure strips away the performance and leaves only the raw nature underneath. And it is in these sudden moments, even more than in the long, patient stretches, that the difference between these two men shows itself most starkly. Because when the heat came without warning, one of them became more controlled, more precise, more terrifyingly calm, while the other came apart, lashing out or breaking down, ruled by the feelings he could not master. Start with the single scene that, more than any other, defines Gus Fring's command of himself under pressure. It comes at a moment of real crisis for him. His operation has been thrown into danger by the reckless actions of the two men working for him, who have killed one of his chemists to protect themselves, leaving him without his backup cook and forcing his hand. He arrives at the lab where they are waiting, and the tension is unbearable, because everyone in the room expects violence. Walt launches into a desperate, rambling speech, trying to talk his way out of whatever is coming, insisting that he and his partner are too valuable to kill. And Gus says nothing. He simply, silently, changes his clothes, putting on a protective suit, taking his time, letting the silence stretch until it becomes almost impossible to bear. He picks up a blade, he walks toward the two men, and then, instead of harming them, he turns and cuts the throat of one of his own loyal employees, a man who had made a mistake earlier that put the operation at risk, killing him, slowly and deliberately, in front of everyone. When it is done, Gus calmly changes back into his suit, and before he leaves, he says only that everyone should get back to work. The scene is a masterpiece of control, and every detail of it reveals the mind behind it. Gus does not shout. He does not explain himself. He does not indulge in a single unnecessary word or gesture. He carries out an act of shocking violence with the same precise, unhurried calm that he brings to wiping down a table in his restaurant. The killing is not an outburst. It is a message, delivered with total composure, designed to punish a mistake, to re-establish his authority, and to warn the two men what awaits them if they step out of line again, all without touching a single hair on the heads of the men he actually needed alive. Even in the middle of a crisis, even while doing something brutal, Gus is thinking clearly, calculating, choosing the response that serves the plan rather than the response that satisfies his rage. The employee he killed had become a liability, had been spotted where he should not have been, and so the man had to go, but the manner of his going was engineered to accomplish several purposes at once. That is a mind that does not lose itself under pressure. That is a mind that becomes sharper when the stakes rise. The actor who played Gus understood exactly what the scene required, and his approach to it tells you something about the character. He has described how difficult it was to perform, how he had to concentrate so completely that he barely spoke to anyone on set, how the boots he was first given were slightly too large, and he worried he might slip, because slipping would be out of character for a man who was otherwise completely calm and in control. Even the small physical details had to communicate command. A man like Gus does not stumble. He does not fumble. Every movement is deliberate. because the deliberateness is the whole point. The violence is frightening, not because it is wild, but because it is so utterly contained, so perfectly governed by a will that never wavers. And that containment is precisely what Walt could never manage. Because now, consider how Walt behaved when the pressure struck him. Where Gus grew calmer, Walt grew wilder. Where Gus fell silent, Walt talked, rambled, argued, pleaded, threatened. Where Gus made the cold, precise choice, Walt made the hot, impulsive one, over and over, and paid for it every time. His outbursts are scattered throughout the whole series, and they are almost always the source of his greatest disasters. When he felt cornered, he did not retreat into stillness and think. He exploded, or he collapsed. There is a moment when Walt, fully cornered, his options gone, his money out of reach, his family in danger, ends up on the floor of a crawlspace beneath his own house, and rather than responding with any kind of controlled plan, he dissolves into a fit of hysterical laughter and weeping at the same time, a man completely overwhelmed by the pressure, unable to hold himself together at all. It is a powerful and human scene, and it is exactly the kind of scene you could never imagine Gus being in, because Gus would never allow himself to reach that state, and even if he did, he would never let anyone see it. The contrast in how the two men handled provocation is especially telling, because provocation is the purest test of emotional control. Anyone can stay calm when nothing is pushing at them. The real test is whether a person can stay calm when someone is deliberately trying to make them lose control, when their pride is being poked, when they are being insulted or dismissed or challenged. And here, Walt fails again and again. His pride was a button that anyone could press, and pressing it reliably made him do something rash. When he was disrespected, he had to answer. When he was underestimated, he had to prove himself. When someone took credit for his work, he had to correct them, even when correcting them was the most dangerous thing he could possibly do. His need to be acknowledged as the smartest, most powerful man in the room was so strong that it overrode his judgment constantly, and his enemies, when they understood this, could use it against him. Gus, by contrast, was almost impossible to provoke into a mistake. Insults slid off him. His great enemy, the man who had ordered the murder of his partner, and who ended up crippled and confined to a wheelchair, spent years trying to needle Gus, ringing a bell at him, refusing to look at him, doing everything a broken man could do to get under his skin. And for the most part, Gus simply absorbed it, letting the provocation wash over him, giving nothing away. He understood that reacting to provocation is how a person hands control of the situation to the one provoking them, and he refused to hand over that control. He even said at one point that he did not believe fear to be an effective motivator, a line that captures his whole philosophy. He did not operate through the hot emotions of rage and intimidation. He operated through cold calculation, and cold calculation does not get provoked, because it is not driven by feeling in the first place. This difference had enormous practical consequences, and it is not a matter of style, but of survival. Walt's outbursts got people killed, and worse, got Walt into situations that threatened his own survival. His impulsive violence created enemies and loose ends. His prideful need to be recognized planted the clues that eventually led the law toward him. His inability to absorb an insult without answering it drew him into confrontations he did not need to have. Every time he lost control, even for a moment, the cost was real, and it accumulated. Gus's control, by contrast, kept him safe, because he never reacted rashly. He never created the kind of self-inflicted wound that Walt kept inflicting. His calm was not merely a personality trait. It was a survival strategy, a way of moving through a lethal world without leaving the trail of impulsive mistakes that gets careless men caught and killed. There is a way of understanding Gus's control that goes beyond simply calling it discipline, and it deserves to be said carefully. Gus did not feel nothing. That would make him a machine, and a machine is not impressive, because a machine has nothing to control. What made Gus remarkable is that he clearly felt a great deal, that beneath the calm surface there was grief and rage and love and hatred of an intensity that had driven him for 20 years, and that he had learned to keep all of it locked away so completely that it almost never touched his actions. The rare moments when a flicker of feeling did break through, a trembling in his voice when he spoke of his lost partner, a flash of something behind his eyes when his great enemy was near, are so unusual precisely because they stand out against a surface that is otherwise perfectly still. He was not a man without emotion. He was a man whose emotion was entirely in service to his mind, held down, harnessed, never permitted to steer. Walt was the reverse. Walt felt a great deal too, but his feelings, especially his pride and his resentment, were forever in the driver's seat, with his brilliant mind riding along behind, working overtime to justify wherever the feelings took him. This is the crucial thing to understand about the difference between the two men, because it is easy to mistake it for a difference in intelligence, when it is really a difference in the ordering of the self. Both men were smart. Both men were emotional. In Gus, the mind commanded and the emotions obeyed. In Walt, the emotions commanded and the mind obeyed, dressing up each emotional decision in the clothes of a rational one. When Walt killed in a rage, and then insisted the killing had been necessary, that was his mind serving his feelings, inventing a justification after the fact. When Gus killed with cold precision to protect his operation, that was his mind serving the plan, and the feeling, whatever it was, had no say. The show even lets Gus articulate the philosophy that separates the two men, in a quiet exchange that cuts to the heart of everything. When Walt tries to defend the terrible things he has done by saying that he did them for the good of his family, Gus does not argue. He simply observes that if the decisions were made for the family, then they were not bad decisions, and asks what a man should do for his family. The line is chilling in its calm, because it accepts terrible acts as reasonable, so long as they serve a clear purpose, so long as they are governed by a goal, rather than by an impulse. It is the philosophy of a man who has fully subordinated feeling to purpose, who judges every action by whether it serves the plan, and who has no patience for the emotional flailing that governs a man like Walt. Whether one finds that philosophy admirable or monstrous, it is undeniably the philosophy of a mind in total command of itself. And that command is exactly what allowed Gus to survive for 20 years, while Walt burned out in 2. So on the sudden test, the test that comes without warning, the verdict is as clear as it was on the long test of patience. When the pressure struck, Gus became more controlled, and Walt became less. Gus turned crisis into calculation. Walt turned crisis into outburst or collapse. Gus could not be provoked into a mistake. Walt could be provoked into a mistake by almost anyone who understood where his pride lived. And in a world where a single loss of control could mean death, the man who never lost control was operating on a level the man who lost it constantly could never reach. The chicken man who cut a throat without raising his heart rate, then calmly told the room to get back to work, understood something about survival that the teacher weeping on the floor of his crawlspace never would. Yet even the most controlled mind has its blind spot, and Gus was no exception. Underneath all that discipline sat one thing he could not fully govern, and understanding it is the next step toward understanding how a man this careful could ever be beaten at all. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. One man grew calmer under sudden pressure, while the other came apart, and the real difference was which force ruled the man, the mind or the feelings. Next come the blind spots, the fatal weaknesses each brilliant mind carried without ever quite seeing. Even the most disciplined operator has one crack in the wall. Section 6. The cracks in both men. No mind, however brilliant, is without a blind spot. The very qualities that make a person strong tend to cast a shadow, and in that shadow sits the one weakness they cannot see, precisely because it is hidden by the strength that stands in front of it. A confident man cannot see the danger in his confidence. A patient man cannot always see the danger in his patience. A person's greatest gift and their fatal flaw are often the same trait, viewed from two sides, and the more powerful the gift, the more dangerous the flaw hiding behind it. Both of the men at the center of this story carried such a flaw, and understanding those two flaws is the key to understanding how their long contest finally ended. Because in the end, neither man was undone by a lack of intelligence. Each was undone by the shadow of his own greatest strength. Walter White's flaw is the easier of the two to see, because the show puts it on display constantly, in scene after scene, until it becomes impossible to miss. His flaw was his ego, his pride, his bottomless need to be recognized as the brilliant and powerful man he believed himself to be. This need was not a small thing, a minor character quirk. It was the engine of his entire descent, the force that drove him into the drug trade in the first place, and the force that would eventually destroy him. And the tragedy of it is that his ego and his intelligence were tangled together so tightly that he could never separate them. The same mind that made him a genius also made him desperate to have that genius acknowledged, and the desperation for acknowledgement kept undermining the genius at every turn. The clearest window into this flaw lies in a wound Walt carried from long before the show began, a wound the series returns to again and again. In his younger years, Walt had co-founded a company with a close friend, a scientific venture that grew, after Walt left it, into a business worth billions. Walt had sold his share early, for a sum of only a few $1,000s, and walked away, watching from the sidelines, as the work of his own mind made other people unimaginably rich. He told himself, and everyone else, that he had been cheated, that his friends had stolen his work and cut him out, that the fortune should have been his. But the truth, as the show carefully reveals, was different. Walt had left of his own accord, out of wounded pride, because he had felt inferior to his girlfriend's wealthy family, and could not bear it. He had not been robbed, he had fled, and then spent the rest of his life blaming others for a choice his own ego had made. The wound was self-inflicted, and he could never admit it, because admitting it would mean facing the flaw at the center of himself. This is the crucial thing about Walt's flaw. It was not just that he was proud. It was that his pride prevented him from ever seeing his pride, from ever understanding that the source of his misery and his self-destruction was inside him rather than out in the world. When his former friends, out of genuine kindness, offered to pay for his cancer treatment, no strings attached, an offer that would have let him keep his family safe without ever committing a single crime, he refused it. He refused it because accepting help from the people he had built his whole identity around, resenting, was more than his pride could bear. He would rather cook drugs and destroy everything than accept a hand from the people who reminded him of his own failure. That single decision, driven entirely by ego, set the whole tragedy in motion. A more self-aware man, a man who could see his own flaw, would have taken the money and lived. Walt could not, because his flaw was invisible to him, hidden behind the very pride that was destroying him. And this same ego, this same need to be recognized, followed him through every stage of his rise, and quietly sabotaged him at each one. It made him boast when he should have stayed silent. It made him take risks to prove his superiority when caution would have kept him safe. It made him unable to walk away, even when he had more money than he could ever spend, because the money had never been the point. The point was the feeling of being someone at last, of being powerful, of being feared and respected, and that feeling could never be satisfied, could never be enough, because it was trying to fill a hole that no amount of external power could ever fill. His flaw was that he mistook the recognition of criminals for the thing he actually needed, which was to be genuinely valued by the people who mattered. And by the time he understood the difference, it was far too late. Now here is where the comparison deepens, because it would be easy to conclude that Gus had no such flaw, that his perfect control made him invulnerable. But that is not true, and the ways in which it is not true are what make him a tragic character rather than simply a machine. Gus had a flaw too. His was harder to see because it hid behind his greatest strength, but it was every bit as fatal in the end. Gus's flaw was the one emotion he could never fully master, the one feeling that his discipline could contain but never eliminate: his hatred, his need for revenge. The grief over his murdered partner had given him his extraordinary patience, but it had also planted inside him a hunger for vengeance so deep that it was the one thing capable of pulling him off his careful path. For 20 years, Gus's discipline kept that hunger in check, channeling it into a plan, letting it wait until the moment was right. And when he finally took his revenge on the cartel, wiping out its leadership in a single afternoon, it looked like the ultimate triumph of control. The disciplined mind, at last collecting the debt it had waited 2 decades to claim. But the revenge was not complete. One man remained, the enforcer who had actually pulled the trigger on Gus's partner all those years ago, now old and crippled and confined to a wheelchair, unable to speak or move except for one finger. And here, Gus's flaw revealed itself. He could not simply let the man die, or kill him quickly, and be done with it. He needed the man to suffer. He needed him to know that his entire family had been destroyed, that everything he had built was gone, that Gus had won completely. Gus visited the old man repeatedly, not out of any strategic need, but out of a personal, emotional hunger, to gloat, to rub his victory in the face of the man who had taken everything from him. And that hunger, that one crack in the wall of his control, was the opening his enemies would eventually use to destroy him. This is a subtle and important point about Gus's flaw, and it is what makes it the mirror image of Walt's. Walt's flaw was that his ego ran his whole life, out in the open, constantly. Gus's flaw was that his one uncontrolled emotion, his need for revenge, was so well hidden and so tightly disciplined that it looked, for years, like it was under control, when in fact, it was the single thing capable of making the most careful man in the world behave predictably. Because Gus needed to gloat over his old enemy, he made himself predictable. He established a pattern, a routine, a regular visit to a specific place, driven not by strategy, but by feeling. And in a man whose entire survival depended on being unpredictable, on never establishing a pattern that an enemy could exploit, that one predictable behavior was a fatal vulnerability. The most disciplined operator in the story had one appointment he kept out of pure emotion, and that appointment would kill him. The show even acknowledges this directly, through the character's own words in the later prequel series, where we see Gus at a moment of rare vulnerability, faced with a new and unpredictable enemy, a man who created chaos with the same ease that Gus created order. Gus experiences something he almost never feels: fear. And in reflecting on why he dislikes such chaotic men so intensely, the character admits that it is because he has himself been a loose cannon, has himself been in situations where he could not control himself, and it frightens him. That admission is a window into the truth underneath all the control. The discipline, was not the absence of dangerous impulses. It was the constant suppression of them, a suppression that held for 20 years, but was never perfect, and that would eventually fail at the one point where his deepest emotion could not be denied. So we arrive at a fascinating symmetry. Both men were brilliant. Both men were undone by the shadow of their own greatest strength. Walt's strength was his restless, hungry, driven mind, and its shadow was the ego that could never be satisfied and could never see itself. Gus's strength was his patient, disciplined, controlled mind, and its shadow was the one emotion, the hunger for revenge, that his control could contain, but never fully master. Walt's flaw operated constantly, in the open, sabotaging him a little every day. Gus's flaw operated once, in secret, and cost him everything in a single stroke. But both were, at bottom, the same kind of flaw. Both were the point where feeling overruled the mind. The difference was that in Walt, feeling overruled the mind all the time, while in Gus, feeling overruled the mind only once, at the very end. And this is where the question of who was smarter takes on its full complexity. Because you might argue that a man with one small hidden flaw is smarter than a man whose flaw runs his entire life. And you would be right. Gus's discipline was so complete that it took a flaw hidden 20 years deep, and an enemy clever enough to find it, to bring him down. Walt's flaw was so exposed that any observant enemy could have used it, and many did. On that measure, Gus was clearly the more controlled and the more self-aware, right up until the single moment where his control failed. But you might also argue that Walt's flaw, precisely because it was so visible and so constant, was in a strange way more honest, and that Walt's willingness to let his hunger drive him was also what gave him the ferocious, improvising energy that eventually allowed him to find and exploit the one crack in Gus's armor. There is something to that too, and we will come to it. But before we do, it is worth sitting with the deeper truth that these two flaws reveal, because it goes to the very heart of what intelligence actually is. Raw cleverness, the ability to solve problems and think quickly, is real and valuable, and Walt had it in abundance. But cleverness is not the same as wisdom, and wisdom, in the deepest sense, includes the ability to see and govern oneself. Gus was wiser than Walt in almost every respect, more able to control himself, more able to subordinate feeling to purpose, more able to survive in a lethal world. And yet even Gus was not wise enough to root out his own deepest flaw, to see that his need for revenge had made him predictable, to deny himself the one emotional satisfaction that would prove fatal. Neither man achieved the full self-mastery that would have kept him alive. Gus came far closer than Walt ever did. But close was not enough, and the gap between Gus's near-perfect control and the perfect control that survival actually required was exactly the gap that a hungry, driven, ego-wounded genius could slip through. That is the setup for everything that follows. We have two brilliant men, each carrying a flaw that is the shadow of his greatest strength. One flaw is loud and constant, the other, quiet and singular. And the whole long contest between them comes down to whether Walt's chaotic, ego-driven genius can find and exploit Gus's one hidden crack before Gus's disciplined control can eliminate the threat that Walt represents. It is a contest between two kinds of intelligence and two kinds of flaw. And how it resolves tells us more about the nature of intelligence itself than any amount of abstract argument ever could. Because in the final reckoning, it was not the smarter man who won. It was the man whose flaw happened to be aimed in the right direction at the right moment. And understanding that distinction is the last and most important piece of this entire puzzle. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. There is a crack in each man, the ego that ran Walt's whole life, and the one buried hunger for revenge that Gus could contain, but never kill. Next, those two flaws collide, as the chaotic genius goes hunting for the single hidden weakness in the most careful man alive. The contest between them comes down to one door. Section 7. The Roots of Two Egos. To understand how the final contest between these two men played out, it helps to step back for a moment and look at where each of them came from, at the soil in which their two very different minds first took root. Because a person's way of thinking is not something that appears out of nowhere. It grows out of a history, out of the wounds and losses and choices that shaped them long before we meet them. And the histories of these two men, laid side by side, explain almost everything about why one became a master of control and the other a slave to his own hunger. They started from strangely similar places, two intelligent men who felt the world had not given them their due, but what each of them did with that feeling, the direction each of them turned, could not have been more different. And the difference tells us who was truly the wiser of the two. Begin with Walt, because his origin is the more familiar and the more openly explored. The wound at the center of Walter White was the sense that he had been cheated out of the greatness he deserved. He was, by any measure, an exceptional mind, gifted enough in his field to have contributed to work that earned the highest honors, brilliant enough that even people who barely knew him recognized his talent. And yet he ended up standing at the front of a classroom full of bored teenagers, working a second job at a car wash to make ends meet, swallowing the small daily humiliations of a man who felt the world had passed him by. The gap between what he believed he deserved and what his life had actually become was the open wound he carried everywhere, and it never stopped aching. The origin of that wound, as we touched on earlier, was the company he had helped found and then abandoned. This is worth returning to, because it is the purest illustration of how Walt's mind worked. The version of events Walt told himself was that he had been robbed, that his partners had stolen his work and cut him out of a fortune that should have been his. But the truth the show reveals is that Walt left of his own free will, driven out not by betrayal, but by his own feelings of inferiority when he encountered his girlfriend's wealthy and prominent family. He felt small next to them. He felt that he did not belong. And rather than confront that feeling, rather than work through it, he simply fled, abandoning the woman he was going to marry and selling his share of the company for almost nothing, then spending the next several decades blaming everyone but himself for the outcome. That pattern, the pattern of turning an inner wound into an outer grievance, is the key to Walt's entire character. He could not face the truth that his troubles came from inside him, from his own pride and his own choices, so he projected them outward onto others. His partners became villains who had wronged him. The world became a place that had failed to recognize his brilliance. And when the chance came, through cancer and desperation, to finally prove himself, he seized it not really to help his family, but to answer the wound, to become at last the powerful and significant man he felt he had always deserved to be. His crime was, at its deepest level, an act of ego, a way of finally forcing the world to acknowledge him. And because it grew from ego, it could never be satisfied, because the wound it was trying to heal was not a wound the world could ever close. Only Walt could have closed it, by facing himself honestly, and that was the one thing his pride would never let him do. Now turn to Gus, and here the show is far more careful, far more sparing, revealing his history only in fragments, keeping much of it forever in shadow. But the fragments we have tell a story that begins, in a sense, from a similar place, and then travels in the opposite direction. Gus, too, seems to have come from a background of struggle and of not being given his due. What little we learn of his early life speaks of extreme poverty, of a childhood spent scraping by, of a boy who had to fend for himself from a very young age. There is a haunting story he tells, late in the prequel series, about being a small child who cultivated a fruit tree to feed himself and earn a little money, only to have an animal come and ransack it. What the child did in response is chilling and revealing. He set a trap, waited for hours with total patience, and caught the animal. And then, rather than killing it quickly, he kept it alive, prolonging its suffering, letting it linger in its wounds. That single story, told about a small boy, contains the whole of Gus in miniature. The patience, the willingness to wait for hours for a single result, the cold precision. And underneath it all, the deep, controlled cruelty, the capacity to make an enemy suffer slowly, rather than simply eliminating it. Even as a child, Gus was already the man he would become, a person who could master his impulses in the service of a goal, who could wait, who could plan, who could inflict pain with calculation rather than passion. Where Walt's history is a story of a man fleeing his own feelings, Gus's history, even at its earliest, is a story of a boy already governing his feelings, already bending them to his will. The difference in the two men was there almost from the beginning, but the deepest root of Gus's character, the wound that shaped everything, was the loss we have already discussed, the murder of the partner he loved. And this is where the comparison between the two men becomes truly illuminating, because both of them suffered a great loss, and both of them let that loss define the rest of their lives. Walt's loss was the loss of the recognition and success he felt he deserved. Gus's loss was the loss of the person he loved most in the world. In both cases, the loss became the fuel for everything that followed. But look at what each man did with that fuel. Walt let his loss make him bitter and grasping, and forever hungry for more. Gus let his loss make him patient and disciplined, and utterly focused on a single, distant goal. Same fuel, opposite engines. And the opposite engines produced opposite results. One man who burned out fast, and one who burned steady for 20 years. There is something else worth noticing about the two histories, and it cuts to the question of self-knowledge. Walt spent his whole life lying to himself about his own history, telling a false story in which he was the victim, refusing to see the truth of his own choices. Gus, by contrast, seems to have understood himself with terrible clarity. He knew exactly what he was, knew exactly what had been done to him, knew exactly what he intended to do about it. There is no evidence that Gus lied to himself about his own nature or his own past, the way Walt did. He carried his wound openly, at least within himself, and used it deliberately, as a tool. That difference in self-knowledge is enormous, because a person who understands himself can govern himself, while a person who lies to himself is forever at the mercy of the feelings he refuses to face. Walt's self-deception made him predictable and controllable, because his hidden ego kept steering him without his awareness. Gus's self-knowledge made him disciplined and controlled, because he could see his own impulses clearly enough to master them, at least until the very end. The way the two histories are told by the show reinforces this difference at the level of craft, and it is a detail worth appreciating. Walt's history is laid out in full, explained, dramatized, made explicit, because Walt is a man whose interior we are meant to know completely. Gus's history is kept deliberately mysterious, revealed only in glimpses, precisely because his power comes from what we do not know about him. The people who made the show understood that the less we know about Gus, the more formidable he becomes. That mystery itself is a form of strength, and that choice mirrors the characters themselves. Walt is a man who cannot keep anything hidden, whose every feeling eventually spills out, whose whole story is on the surface. Gus is a man who hides everything, whose depths are never fully sounded, whose history remains a locked box even to the people closest to him. The way we come to know each character is itself a reflection of the kind of mind each one has. This brings us to a question that sits underneath the whole comparison. If both men came from wounds, and both turned those wounds into criminal empires, why did one of them govern himself so much better than the other? And the answer, I think, comes down to what each man was ultimately seeking. Walt was seeking recognition, was seeking to fill an emptiness inside himself, to finally feel like someone. And because he was seeking a feeling, an internal state, he could never get enough of it, because no external achievement can permanently fill an internal void. Gus was seeking something external and specific, the destruction of the people who had murdered his partner, and the building of a legacy in that partner's memory. His goal was outside himself, concrete, achievable. And because his goal was concrete, rather than an endless emotional hunger, he could organize his whole life around achieving it, could measure his progress, could exercise discipline in its service. A man chasing a feeling can never stop, because the feeling always fades. A man chasing a goal can pace himself, because the goal, once reached, is reached. The actor who played Gus captured this distinction beautifully in reflecting on the character. He observed that when Walt said, at the very end, that making and selling drugs had made him feel alive, that was never what it was about for Gus. Walt was chasing the feeling of being alive, of filling the emptiness inside. Gus was not. Gus was cultivating a business, pursuing a purpose, working towards specific ends. He was not trying to feel a certain way. He was trying to accomplish certain things. And that difference between a man ruled by the pursuit of a feeling and a man ruled by the pursuit of a goal is perhaps the deepest root of everything that separated them. The man chasing a feeling was doomed to a kind of endless, restless hunger that would eventually consume him. The man chasing a goal had a discipline that a hunger for feeling could never match. And yet, in a final twist that keeps this from being too simple, both men were in the end brought down by feeling, just in different measures. Walt was ruled by feeling constantly, and it destroyed him slowly. Gus subordinated feeling almost entirely, and it destroyed him only once, at the single point where his buried hunger for revenge broke through his control. So even the most disciplined man in the story could not fully escape the pull of his own emotions. He could only manage them far better than Walt ever could, for far longer, at far less cost. The roots of the two men, traced all the way back, show us two intelligent people who started from wounds and turned in opposite directions, one toward the endless pursuit of a feeling, and the other toward the disciplined pursuit of a goal. One direction led to 20 years of survival. The other led to 2 years of self-destruction. And which of those directions represents the wiser mind is a question that, by now, has begun to answer itself. The histories set the stage. Two wounded men, two opposite responses, two minds shaped by loss into two very different instruments. What remains is to watch those instruments finally clash, to see the chaotic, ego-driven genius go hunting for the one hidden weakness in the disciplined, goal-driven master. That collision is where the whole comparison finally comes to its point, where the theory of who was smarter gives way to the reality of who survived and who did not, and where the surprising truth about intelligence itself finally reveals its full shape. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Both men trace back to wounded roots that turned in opposite directions, one chasing a feeling that could never be filled, the other pursuing a goal that could be reached. Next, the two of them finally collide, as the hungry genius hunts for the single crack in the most careful man alive. Section 8. The Hunt for a Single Crack. When two powerful minds are locked in the same small world, both trying to survive, both aware that the other is a threat, the contest between them rarely explodes all at once. It builds slowly, through a long series of quiet moves and counter-moves, each man testing the other, probing for weakness, adjusting, waiting. The war between these two men was exactly this kind of war. A long, tense, patient game played out over many months, in which the outcome was never certain and the balance of power kept shifting. And to understand how it ended, and what the ending reveals about which man was truly the smarter, we have to understand the shape of that game, the way each man approached it, and the single decisive difference in how they thought about each other. For a long stretch of their relationship, Gus held all the power, and he held it precisely because of his discipline. He had brought Walt into his operation, because Walt's product was the finest he had ever encountered. But he had done so cautiously, on his own terms, keeping Walt at a distance, surrounding him with his own people, making sure that Walt was always replaceable, always contained, always under control. Gus understood that a partner as brilliant and as unstable as Walt was both an asset and a danger, and he arranged everything to maximize the asset while minimizing the danger. He built a system of checks around Walt, using his loyal fixer to keep an eye on him, keeping a second chemist available so that Walt could be discarded if he became too much trouble. Every element of the arrangement reflected Gus's way of thinking, which was to never depend too heavily on any single person, to always have a backup, to always be able to walk away. Walt, for his part, spent this stretch of the war in a position of weakness and knew it. He was inside another man's operation, dependent on another man's protection, aware at every moment that the man he worked for was calmer, smarter, in the ways that mattered, more experienced, and perfectly willing to have him killed the instant he became more trouble than he was worth. The tension of this period is the tension of a man trapped in a cage, built by someone far more careful than himself, looking for a way out, looking for a weakness, looking for any opening at all. And here is where the two kinds of intelligence we have been discussing began to matter most, because Walt's particular gift, his restless, improvising, problem-solving genius, was actually well suited to exactly this situation, the situation of a cornered man searching for an escape. The turning point came when Gus finally decided that Walt had become too dangerous to keep and moved to eliminate him. Walt, cornered and desperate, did something that revealed both his brilliance and his ruthlessness. Rather than accept his fate, he engineered a situation that made himself impossible to kill, at least for the moment, by having his partner eliminate the backup chemist, so that Walt became once again the only person who could produce the product Gus needed. It was a bold, improvised move, made under enormous pressure, and it worked, buying Walt time. But it also enraged Gus, and it led directly to the terrible scene we discussed earlier, in which Gus, unable to kill the men he needed, killed one of his own loyal employees instead, as a message. The war had escalated. Both men now knew the other was trying to destroy him, and the question became, which of them would find the decisive opening first? This is where the deepest difference in how the two men thought revealed itself, and it is the difference on which everything turned. Gus, for all his brilliance, made one fundamental error in how he assessed Walt. He underestimated him, not his intelligence exactly, but his unpredictability, his desperation, his willingness to do absolutely anything to survive. Gus was a man who thought in terms of order, of systems, of rational actors making rational choices, and within that framework he could not fully account for a man as chaotic and driven and reckless as Walt, a man who would do things no sensible operator would ever do, precisely because Walt was not a sensible operator, but a cornered animal with a genius brain. The very control that made Gus so formidable also gave him a blind spot, because a man who governs himself so completely has difficulty imagining an enemy who governs himself not at all. Gus kept expecting Walt to behave like a rational player in a rational game, and Walt kept refusing to. Walt, by contrast, understood something about Gus that Gus did not fully understand about himself. Walt understood that the most careful man in the world had one crack in his armor, one place where feeling ruled instead of calculation. Walt understood, or came to understand, that Gus's hatred of his old enemy, the crippled man in the wheelchair, was the one thing that could make Gus predictable, the one appointment Gus kept out of pure emotion rather than strategy. And Walt understood how to use that. This is the crucial reversal at the heart of the whole story. Throughout their war, Gus was the more disciplined and controlled man, and that discipline was his strength. But in the final reckoning, it was Walt, the emotional and chaotic man, who correctly read the one place where Gus was emotional and chaotic, while Gus, the disciplined man, failed to read the full extent of Walt's chaos. Each man's weakness lay in his failure to fully imagine the other's nature. The plan Walt eventually devised to kill Gus was a perfect expression of his particular genius, and it is worth understanding exactly why it worked, because the reason is deeply revealing. Walt could not reach Gus directly. Gus was too careful, too well protected, too aware of the danger. When Walt first tried to kill Gus with a bomb placed on his car, Gus sensed that something was wrong, some instinct warning him, and simply walked away from the vehicle without ever knowing exactly why. That moment alone tells you how formidable Gus's caution was, that he could feel danger he could not see and avoid it on instinct. Walt could not outplan a man like that in a direct contest, so instead, Walt did something cleverer. He found the one situation in which Gus's caution would be overridden by his hunger for revenge, the one place Gus would go, not because it was safe, but because his need to gloat over his old enemy was stronger than his discipline. Walt approached the crippled old enemy, the last surviving member of the family Gus had destroyed, and offered him a chance at revenge against the man they both hated. He arranged for that helpless old man to become the instrument of Gus's death, planting a bomb that the old man could trigger himself. And then Walt engineered the situation so that Gus would believe his old enemy was about to betray him to the authorities, knowing that this belief would draw Gus to the one place he could not resist going, to personally confront and kill the man who had haunted him for 20 years. Walt's entire plan depended on a single insight: that Gus's need for personal, emotional revenge would override his caution, that the most careful man alive would walk willingly into a trap because his hunger to gloat over his enemy was the one thing stronger than his discipline. And Walt was right. The scene of Gus's death is one of the most famous in all of television, and it plays out exactly as Walt predicted. Gus, believing he is about to complete his long revenge, goes to the nursing home to kill his old enemy personally. His people sweep the room for danger and find nothing, because the danger is hidden beneath the wheelchair. Gus enters, calm and confident, ready to savor his victory over the broken man before him. He begins to deliver his final words, and then the old man, for the first time in years, lifts his eyes and looks directly at Gus with pure, blazing hatred. And Gus understands, in a single terrible instant, that he has been played. He tries to turn and flee, but it is too late. The bomb goes off, and then comes the image that has become legendary: Gus walking out of the smoke and fire, seeming for a moment to have survived, calmly straightening his tie in a final act of composure, before the camera reveals that half his face has been blown away, and he collapses, dead. Even in death, Gus was in control of himself. That final gesture, adjusting his tie with half his face gone, is the perfect summation of the character, a man who maintained his dignity and his composure right up to the last second of his life, who went to his death doing what he had always done, which was to remain complete and controlled and unbroken. The actor who played him understood the gesture as an expression of exactly this, of a man returning, in his final moment, to what he had always been. And there is something almost admirable in it, something that commands respect. Gus died as he lived, in command of himself, even when his body was destroyed. But he died, and he died because of the one flaw his discipline could never fully master, the hunger for revenge that made him predictable, that drew him to the one place he should never have gone. So who was the smarter man in this final contest? The honest answer is complicated, and the complication is the whole point. Walt won. Walt found the crack and exploited it. And that took a kind of genius, a ferocious, improvising, insightful genius that correctly read the one weakness in the most careful man alive. There is no taking that away from him. But look closely at how he won, because it matters enormously. Walt did not defeat Gus by being more disciplined, or more controlled, or more careful, because he was none of those things. Walt defeated Gus by being more chaotic, more desperate, more willing to do the unthinkable, and by understanding that his enemy had one point of emotional vulnerability. Walt's victory was not a victory of superior operational intelligence. It was a victory of a cornered animal's cunning, aimed precisely at the single human weakness in an otherwise superhuman machine. And here is the deeper truth that the ending reveals. Gus was, in almost every measurable way, the smarter operator. He survived for 20 years. He built a larger, safer, better disguised empire. He controlled himself with a discipline Walt could never approach. He made fewer mistakes, took fewer risks, left fewer traces. By any reasonable standard of how to run a criminal enterprise and stay alive, Gus was operating on a level far above Walt. And yet he was beaten, not because he was less intelligent, but because he had one flaw, one crack, one appointment he kept out of pure emotion, and because his enemy happened to be exactly the kind of desperate, insightful, rule-breaking mind capable of finding and exploiting that single flaw. Gus's defeat does not prove that Walt was smarter. It proves that even the smartest, most disciplined operator can be undone by a single weakness, if the right enemy finds it at the right moment. This is why the question of who was smarter cannot be settled simply by pointing at who survived. Survival in a single contest is not the same as being the wiser mind. A brilliant chess player can lose a game to a weaker opponent who happens to spot one particular trap, and that single loss does not make the weaker player the better one. Gus lost one game, the last one, to an opponent who found his one blind spot, but across the whole long stretch of their lives, across every other measure of how to think and operate and survive in that lethal world, Gus was the superior mind, the more controlled, the more disciplined, the more genuinely intelligent, in the deep sense that includes the mastery of oneself. Walt's victory was real, and it was earned, but it was the victory of a flaw finding a flaw, not the victory of a greater mind over a lesser one. And so we come to the edge of the final judgment, with all the evidence now before us. Two brilliant men, two opposite kinds of intelligence, two flaws that were each the shadow of a strength. One man won a single decisive contest by exploiting the one weakness in the other. The other man was, in nearly every other respect, the more masterful operator, undone at last by the single crack in his own discipline. What remains is to weigh all of it, to answer as honestly as we can the question this whole journey set out to answer, and to draw from these two men the deeper lesson about what intelligence really is, and why the flashier mind is not always the wiser one. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The two minds finally collide, and the disciplined master is undone, not by a greater intellect, but by the single crack in his own control, found by a desperate genius who read his one emotional weakness. Next comes the reckoning, the honest weighing of everything, and the surprising truth about what intelligence really means. Section 9. What winning actually proves. There is a temptation, when comparing two people, to let the final outcome settle everything. One man is alive at the end, and the other is dead. So surely the living one was the better, the smarter, the more capable. It is a natural way to think, and it feels satisfyingly simple. But it is also, on closer inspection, deeply misleading. Because the outcome of a single contest is shaped by far more than the relative intelligence of the two people involved. It is shaped by luck, by timing, by the specific nature of the flaw each person happens to carry, by which weakness the enemy happens to find first. To judge who was smarter, purely by who survived, is to mistake the result of one game for the measure of the whole player. And it is exactly the mistake that the ending of this story invites us to make, and then, if we look carefully, quietly corrects. Consider first what Walt's victory actually required, and what it did not. It did not require him to be more disciplined than Gus, because he was not. It did not require him to build a safer or more enduring empire, because he did not. It did not require him to control his emotions better, to make fewer mistakes, to leave fewer traces, to survive longer, because on every one of those measures, Gus was clearly superior. What Walt's victory required was one thing, and one thing only. It required him to correctly identify and exploit the single point of emotional vulnerability in his enemy. That is a real skill, and a formidable one, and it should not be dismissed. But it is a very specific skill, and it is not the same as being the more intelligent operator overall. Walt was a specialist in the desperate, improvised, insightful strike. Gus was a master of the long, disciplined, sustained campaign. Walt won the one kind of contest at which he excelled, against a man whose excellence lay everywhere else. And even Walt's decisive strike depended on something outside his own genius, namely the existence of Gus's flaw. If Gus had not carried that one buried hunger for revenge, if he had been able to simply let his old enemy die without needing to gloat, if he had denied himself that single emotional indulgence, Walt would have had nothing to exploit. There would have been no predictable appointment, no place Gus went out of feeling rather than strategy, no crack for Walt to slip through. Walt's victory was not something he manufactured out of pure superior intellect. It was something he found, an existing weakness in his enemy that he was clever enough to recognize and ruthless enough to use. The genius was in the finding and the using, but the weakness had to be there first, and its existence was Gus's failing, not Walt's achievement. Walt did not outthink a flawless machine. He located the one flaw in a nearly flawless machine and drove a wedge into it. This distinction matters enormously for the question we are trying to answer, because it separates two things that are easily confused. There is the question of who could win a single, specific contest under specific conditions, and there is the question of who possessed the greater intelligence overall. These are not the same question, and they can have different answers. Walt could win that particular contest because it played to his particular strengths, and because his enemy happened to have the particular flaw that Walt's strengths could exploit. But that does not make Walt the smarter man in general. It makes him the man better suited to win that one specific kind of fight. Put the two of them in a different contest. A contest of endurance, of discipline, of building something that lasts, of surviving over decades. And Gus wins every time, has already won, in a sense, before the contest even begins, because he had already survived for 20 years, while Walt burned out in 2. There is a useful way to think about this, drawn from the world of games. Imagine a chess master, a truly great player, who has won hundreds of games against strong opponents over many years. Now imagine that master loses a single game to a weaker but cunning player, who has studied one particular weakness in the master's style and set a trap around it. Does that single loss mean the weaker player is the better chess player? Of course not. It means the weaker player found one specific opening and exploited it in one specific game. The master remains the superior player, as the whole body of his play demonstrates. The single loss is real, and it counts, but it does not overturn the larger truth. This is almost exactly the situation with Walt and Gus. Gus was the master, with a long record of masterful play. Walt was the cunning opponent, who found one opening and won one game, the last one, the one that happened to be fatal. That the game was fatal makes it feel more decisive than it really is, as a measure of intelligence, but the logic is the same. One loss does not make the weaker player the greater one. Now someone might object that in this world, unlike chess, the single fatal loss is the only one that matters, because death ends everything, and there is truth in that. In the deadly game these men played, surviving is the whole point, and Gus did not survive. But notice what this objection actually concedes. It concedes that Gus was the better operator in every respect except the one that killed him, and it argues that the one that killed him outweighs all the rest. That may be true as a matter of consequences, but it is not true as a matter of intelligence. It simply means that, in a game where one mistake can be fatal, even a vastly superior player can be destroyed by a single error, if the right opponent finds it. That is a statement about the brutal unforgivingness of the game, not about the relative intelligence of the players. Gus was smarter, and still died, because in his world, being smarter is not always enough. One crack, found by the right enemy, can bring down the most brilliant mind. That is the tragedy of Gus, and it is a tragedy precisely because he was the superior mind, not despite it. There is another dimension to this that deserves careful attention, and it concerns the price of each man's approach. Walt won, yes, but look at what winning cost him, and everyone around him. His way of operating, driven by ego and impulse, and the constant creation of new problems, left a trail of devastation that ultimately consumed not just his enemies, but his family, his partner, and himself. He won the contest against Gus, but he lost nearly everything else, and his victory over Gus was only one step on a road that led to total ruin. The chaotic, improvising, ego-driven genius that let him defeat Gus was the very same genius that destroyed his own life, because it was a mind that could win individual battles brilliantly, while losing the larger war catastrophically. Gus, by contrast, though he lost his final battle, ran a far cleaner and more successful operation for a far longer time, precisely because his disciplined approach did not generate the constant collateral damage that Walt's chaos produced. This points to something important about the two kinds of intelligence, something that goes beyond who beat whom. Walt's intelligence was tactical, brilliant at solving the immediate problem, at finding the clever escape, at the improvised strike. Gus's intelligence was strategic, brilliant at building systems that lasted, at avoiding problems before they arose, at the long, patient campaign. Tactical intelligence wins moments. Strategic intelligence wins lifetimes. And while Walt's tactical genius won him the single moment of Gus's death, it was Gus's strategic genius that had won him 20 years of survival and success beforehand. The moment is more dramatic, more visible, more satisfying to watch. But the 20 years represent the deeper accomplishment, the harder thing to do, the truer sign of a superior mind operating in that world. It is worth pausing here to be fair to Walt, because this comparison is not an attempt to dismiss him. Walt was, in the narrow sense of raw problem-solving ability, quite possibly the more gifted of the two. His mind was faster, more flexible, more inventive. In a direct test of cleverness, of the ability to solve a difficult puzzle under pressure, Walt might well have come out ahead. The show itself seems to suggest this, presenting Walt as perhaps the single most brilliant problem solver in its entire world. What Walt lacked was not intelligence in that sense. What he lacked was wisdom, the deeper intelligence that includes the mastery of oneself, the ability to govern one's own impulses, to see one's own flaws, to subordinate feeling to purpose. He had the more dazzling mind and the weaker character. Gus had the less dazzling mind, perhaps, but the far stronger character. And in the world they lived in, character mattered more than dazzle, because character is what keeps a person from making the fatal mistake. And this is perhaps the deepest lesson buried in the comparison, the thing that makes it worth thinking about, beyond the confines of the show itself. We tend to admire and reward the flashy kind of intelligence, the quick wit, the clever solution, the improvised brilliance. And that kind of intelligence is genuinely valuable and genuinely impressive. But there is another kind of intelligence, quieter and less visible, that is often more important in the long run. It is the intelligence of patience, of discipline, of self-control, of knowing yourself well enough to govern yourself. This kind of intelligence does not dazzle. It does not produce dramatic moments of brilliance. It produces something less exciting, but far more valuable, which is the steady, sustained success that comes from not making the mistakes that undo other people. Gus embodied this quieter intelligence to an almost superhuman degree, and it is why he survived and thrived for so long. Walt embodied the flashier kind, and it is why he shone so brightly and burned out so fast. So when we ask who was smarter, we have to be clear about what we mean. If we mean who had the quicker, more inventive mind, the answer might well be Walt. If we mean who understood the game they were both playing more deeply, who controlled himself more completely, who operated with greater wisdom and discipline and self-mastery, who survived longer and built better and made fewer fatal errors, the answer is clearly Gus. The single fact of Gus's death does not overturn this, because his death was the result of one flaw, finding one enemy at one moment, not the result of being the lesser mind. In every respect except that single fatal crack, Gus operated on a level Walt never reached. And even the crack that killed him was a crack in an otherwise magnificent structure, a single weakness in a discipline so complete that it took an enemy as desperate and insightful as Walt, at the peak of his own cornered genius, to find and exploit it. The honest verdict, then, is not the simple one the ending seems to offer. The simple verdict says Walt won, so Walt was smarter, and it is wrong. The deeper verdict says that Gus was, in nearly every meaningful sense, the smarter and wiser operator, that his defeat came not from inferior intelligence, but from the one emotional flaw his otherwise total discipline could not master, and that Walt's victory, real and impressive as it was the victory of a specific kind of desperate cunning, exploiting a specific kind of hidden weakness, rather than the triumph of a greater mind over a lesser one. Gus was the better criminal, the better strategist, the better master of himself, right up until the single moment where he was not. And that single moment cost him everything, as single moments do in a world that forgives nothing. That is nearly the whole of the answer, but not quite all of it, because there is one final thing to say, one last turn of the argument that pulls everything together and reveals why this comparison has fascinated people for so long. It has to do with what each man's fate says about the kind of intelligence he represented, and about which kind of mind we should actually admire. and about the strange and uncomfortable truth that the wiser man does not always win, and that winning does not always mean what we think it means. That final turn is where this entire journey has been heading, and it is where we will bring it to rest. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Winning a single contest turns out not to be the same as being the wiser mind. And Gus stands revealed as the superior operator, undone by one flaw rather than by any lack of intelligence. Next comes the final reckoning, the answer to the question that started it all, and the deeper truth about which kind of mind truly deserves admiration. Section 10. The verdict. Every long journey of comparison eventually has to arrive somewhere, has to stop weighing and start deciding, has to look at everything that has been gathered and say, as honestly as it can, what all of it adds up to. We began with a simple question that turned out not to be simple at all. Of the two great criminal minds at the heart of Breaking Bad, which one was actually the smarter man? The chemistry teacher who won the final fight, or the soft-spoken businessman who lost it? And now, after tracing both men through their blueprints, their masks, their patience, their control, their flaws, their roots, and their final collision, we can finally give the answer the question deserves, which is not the easy answer the ending seems to hand us, but a truer and more interesting one. The verdict, stated plainly, is this: Gustavo Fring was the smarter man. Not smarter in every single respect, and not in the narrow sense of raw mental horsepower, where a real case can be made that Walter White stood above him, but smarter in the deepest and most important sense, the sense that actually determines survival and success in the world these two men inhabited. Gus understood the game they were both playing more completely, controlled himself more totally, operated with greater discipline and patience and wisdom, and by every measure, except the single one that killed him, functioned on a level Walter White never reached. The man who lost the final battle was, across the whole long war of their lives, the superior mind. And understanding why that is true, despite the fact that he ended up dead on a nursing home floor, is the whole point of everything we have examined. Let us be clear about what we are not saying, because the easy version of this argument gets it wrong. We are not saying that Walt was stupid, because he was anything but. Walt was, quite possibly, the more brilliant problem solver of the two. Faster, more flexible, more inventive, capable of improvised feats of cleverness that Gus, for all his planning, rarely needed to attempt. If the question were simply, who had the quicker and more dazzling mind, the answer might well be Walt. The show itself seems to present him as perhaps the single most gifted mind in its entire world, a man who could think his way out of almost any immediate crisis. That gift was real, and it should not be diminished. Walt's intelligence, in the narrow sense, was formidable. What he lacked was not intelligence, but wisdom, and the difference between those two things is the difference between the two men. Because intelligence, in the sense that mattered most in their world, was never really about cleverness. It was about the mastery of oneself. It was about the ability to control one's impulses, to see one's own flaws, to subordinate feeling to purpose, to wait when waiting served the goal, to stay hidden when the ego screamed to be seen, to make the safe choice rather than the satisfying one. On every one of these measures, Gus operated at a level that Walt could barely imagine. Gus could wait 20 years, where Walt could not wait 20 minutes. Gus could absorb the deepest possible provocation without a flicker, where Walt could be provoked into disaster by the smallest slight. Gus could disappear perfectly into a disguise, where Walt could not stop stepping out from behind his, to remind the world how brilliant he was. Gus could subordinate even his grief and his rage to a plan where Walt let his pride and his resentment run his entire life. The businessman had mastered himself. The teacher never could. It is worth dwelling for a moment on how rare that mastery truly is, because it is the easiest thing in the world to underestimate. Cleverness announces itself. It solves the visible puzzle, escapes the visible trap, and everyone in the room can see the brilliance of it. Self-mastery announces nothing. It shows up as an absence, as the crisis that never happened, the enemy that was never made, the mistake that was never committed, the secret that was never spilled. It is invisible by its very nature, and because it is invisible, we tend to give it no credit, to overlook it entirely in favor of the flashier gift that dazzles us in the moment. But in the world these two men lived in, the invisible gift was worth infinitely more than the visible one, because the invisible gift kept a man alive. Gus's greatest achievements were the disasters that never occurred, the 20 years of quiet in which nothing went wrong, because he had arranged, through relentless discipline, for nothing to be allowed to go wrong. We almost never notice that kind of genius, precisely because it works, and working, in his line of business, meant leaving no trace at all. And this self-mastery was not a minor virtue in their world. It was the whole difference between survival and destruction. Every impulsive act Walt committed left a trail. Every provocation he answered created an enemy. Every moment of pride he indulged planted a clue. Every problem he solved brilliantly in the moment created two new problems down the line, because he was always improvising, always reacting, always generating the very crises that his genius then had to escape. Gus, by contrast, made fewer mistakes, because he created fewer problems, took fewer risks, left fewer traces, moved only when moving was safe, and stayed perfectly still the rest of the time. Walt's chaotic brilliance produced a life that burned bright and collapsed in 2 years, taking everyone he loved down with it. Gus's disciplined intelligence produced an empire that ran clean and hidden for 20. The teacher's fireworks were more spectacular. The businessman's steady flame lasted 10 times longer, and lasting is what intelligence, in that world, was actually for. But then, of course, there is the fact that will not go away. The fact that seems to overturn everything. Gus lost. Gus died. Walt beat him. And any honest verdict has to reckon with that fully, not wave it away. So let us reckon with it directly. Gus lost. But he did not lose, because he was the lesser mind. He lost because he carried one flaw, one single crack, in an otherwise magnificent structure of discipline, the one buried hunger for revenge that his control could contain, but never fully eliminate. And he was beaten by an enemy who happened to be exactly the kind of desperate, insightful, rule-breaking mind capable of finding and exploiting that one crack. Walt's victory was real, and it was earned, and it took a genuine and ferocious genius to achieve. But it was the victory of a specific weakness, finding a specific weakness, not the triumph of a greater mind over a lesser one. Gus was a chess master who lost one game, the fatal one, to a cunning opponent who had studied his single blind spot. The loss was real. It did not make the opponent the greater player. There is a hard truth buried in this, and it is worth naming plainly, because it reaches far beyond the show itself. The wiser person does not always win. In a world that forgives nothing, where a single mistake can be fatal, even a vastly superior mind can be destroyed by one flaw, if the right enemy finds it at the right moment. Gus's death does not prove that discipline and self-mastery are worthless. It proves the opposite. It proves how nearly perfect a person must be to survive in such a world. That even a discipline as total as Gus's, a control so complete that it took 20 years, and an enemy as extraordinary as Walt to crack it, was still not quite enough. The margin for error was 0, and Gus made one error, one emotional appointment he could not resist keeping, and it cost him everything. That is not a story about the failure of wisdom. It is a story about how unforgiving the game was, and how close even the wisest player came to winning it completely. And here is where the comparison gives us something genuinely valuable, something worth carrying away. We live in a culture that tends to admire the flashy kind of intelligence, the quick wit, the clever solution, the improvised brilliance, the person who dazzles. Walt is that kind of intelligence made flesh, and he is thrilling to watch, precisely because of it. But there is another kind of intelligence, quieter and far less visible, that is often more important in the long run. It is the intelligence of patience, of discipline, of self-control, of knowing yourself well enough to govern yourself. It does not produce dramatic moments. It produces something less exciting, but far more durable, the steady, sustained success that comes from simply not making the mistakes that undo other people. Gus embodied this quieter intelligence almost perfectly, and it is why he survived and thrived for so long. The lesson is that the mind we should admire is not always the one that dazzles. Often, it is the one that endures. There is a distinction that captures the whole thing, and it is the distinction between a man ruled by the pursuit of a feeling and a man ruled by the pursuit of a goal. Walt, at the deepest level, was chasing a feeling, the feeling of being someone, of mattering, of being recognized and feared and respected, of filling the emptiness inside himself. And because he was chasing a feeling, an internal state that no external achievement could ever permanently satisfy, he could never stop, never be content, never make the safe choice over the one that fed his hunger. Gus was chasing a goal, a specific and external thing, the destruction of the men who had murdered the person he loved, and a legacy built in that person's memory. And because his goal was concrete, rather than an endless emotional hunger, he could organize his entire life around it, with discipline and patience. The man chasing a feeling was doomed to a restless hunger that would eventually consume him. The man chasing a goal had a focus that a hunger for feeling could never match. That difference, more than any difference in raw intellect, is what separated the two minds. And yet, in the end, both men were brought down by feeling, which is perhaps the final and most human truth of the whole comparison. Walt was ruled by feeling constantly, and it destroyed him slowly, over 2 years of escalating catastrophe. Gus subordinated feeling almost entirely, and it destroyed him only once, at the single point where his buried hunger for revenge broke through his control. So even the most disciplined man in the story could not fully escape the pull of his own emotions. He could only manage them far better than Walt ever could, for far longer, at far less cost. Neither man achieved the perfect self-mastery that survival actually required. Gus came far closer than Walt ever did, close enough that it took a flaw hidden 20 years deep and an enemy of rare genius to bring him down. But close was not enough, because in that world, close was never enough. And there is something almost unbearably sad in that, when you sit with it, because it means the better mind was not rewarded for being better. It was punished for the one place where it was still human, the one wound it could never quite heal, the one door it could not stop itself from walking through. The very thing that made Gus a person rather than a machine, the buried love and the buried grief underneath all that control, was the thing that finally killed him. So we return, at the last, to the man walking out of the smoke with half his face gone, calmly straightening his tie before he falls. That image, which we opened with, contains the whole answer. It is the image of a man who remained in command of himself even as his body was destroyed, who went to his death, doing what he had always done, remaining complete and controlled and unbroken to the final second. He lost, he died, and he was still, in that moment and in every moment before it, the more masterful mind, the more disciplined operator, the wiser man. His defeat was not the defeat of a lesser intelligence, but the defeat of a superior one, undone by a single crack, found by the one enemy capable of finding it. Walt won the fight. Gus won the argument about who was smarter, and he won it across 20 years of survival that Walt could never have matched. The teacher had the more dazzling mind and the weaker character. The businessman had the quieter mind, perhaps, and the far stronger character. And in a world where a single loss of control meant death, character was worth more than dazzle. Walt could outthink Gus in a single moment of crisis. Gus could outlast Walt across an entire lifetime, and did, until one flaw undid him. If intelligence means the ability to solve a hard problem quickly, then perhaps Walt wins. But if intelligence means the deeper thing, the ability to understand the game, to master oneself, to survive and endure, and build something that lasts, then the answer is clear, and it belongs to the quiet man in the pressed yellow shirt who hid an empire behind a chicken counter and waited 20 years for his revenge without a single slip, until the very end. Gus Fring was smarter than Walter White, not because he won, because he did not, but because being smart, in the truest sense, was never about winning a single fight. It was about everything else, and in everything else, he was the master. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.